but boy, there were a few whose musicianship just blew everything else out of the water. Like Winger is an example. Red Beach is phenomenal, or
Oh, blown
or
away.
oh man, or Dokken, George Lynch,
George Lynch,
one
yep.
of those incredible guitar players. And I have no idea where I was going with this. I was leading to a question, and it just kind of disappeared into the ether. Oh, I know what it was. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Just me again, Wayne. Here is part two of my three-part interview with Christopher Hilton, author of the book The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. Go back and check out part one if you haven't. And yeah, Christopher his knowledge of the genre of late 80s metal is encyclopedic. I mean, I thought I knew a lot about late 80s metal, and I do, but Christopher makes me look like a pure beginner in the breadth and the depth of his knowledge of the genre. So here it is, part two. Oh, by the way, you can get Christopher's book through Amazon, either for your Kindle or in print form, or you can get it from his website, hairmetalforever.com. Here it is, part two of the interview. I hope you enjoy it. I had not known that Sebastian Bach, I read this in your book, right, fought so hard for the inclusion of I Remember You on that first Skid Row album because he knew that was going to sell, and it did. And then recently
Yeah.
I saw an interview with him in which he just seemed like the most positive guy in the world. He said he was on a beach in Florida, and there were two dudes who saw him, and they sort of started mockingly singing, I remember you, and he just joined in with them, and he said, and it was great, and they all three had just one of those a brief, really nice time. But
Yeah, the band didn't want it on the record. I mean, they wanted to promote themselves, of course, as a rough, heavy metal band. And of course, Sebastian, to your point, recognized it as something that had appeal. And then, he tricked him into playing it while Bob Rock was out there behind the window. And, he just laughed and said, yeah, I mean, that's going on the album. So he knew better.
well, I wanted to ask you, I have a couple more Skid Row related questions, actually, I wanted to ask you.
Fire away. I always have opinions.
Oh, awesome. Okay, well, 1991, right? SoundScan was implemented,
Yes.
and it's and right away, showed that Skid Row and Ozzy and so forth were outselling the fuck out of Whitney Houston and Wilson Phillips and George Michael and so forth. Um, do you think if SoundScan had been implemented, not that they had the technology, but if SoundScan had been in effect, say, for the previous 5 years, the previous 10 years, that 80s metal would have been even a mightier commercial force?
I mean, it's quite possible, at least from the representation of, Billboard chart rankings. I don't know that it really would have moved the needle in terms of the number of people coming out to see the shows or the airplay the videos got. But you're right. Most people don't realize before the advent of SoundScan, Billboard rankings were kind of subjective. I mean, that sounds crazy in this day and age, but it was. I remember Motley Crue was very, very upset upon the release of Girls, Girls, Girls because it came in at number two behind Whitney Houston at number one at the time. And their record company put together all these facts to the best they could assemble. Again, we're in a non-internet age. Said, hey, we're selling the heck out of this thing compared to Whitney Houston. But the powers that be that were marketing the industry said, hey, we need Whitney Houston's album to be number one. So they kind of felt cheated there. Now, of course, they redeemed themselves with Dr. Feelgood, which did hit number one. But yeah, I mean, up until that point, it was a little bit subjective, and it was a big deal, at least for the genre in 1991 when Skid Row's Slave to the Grind came out and immediately went to number one. I mean, that was kind of unheard of. I remember they were on tour with Guns N' Roses at the time. And Sebastian Bach, to your point, always an excitable individual, ran up to Duff McKagan and said, guess whose album is number one? And I was like, whose, Boz? And he's like, well, ours. And, Duff was shocked that could be, especially an album like that moved them so far away from what commercial aspect they did have on their debut. Because Skid Row were a pretty heavy band compared to their peers at the time. If you count their peers as Poison or Bon Jovi or Warrant, they still had the melodies in their songs, but even on their debut, that's some pretty heavy music. But I mean, it was just completely in the other direction with Slave to the Grind. I mean, you could never call this album hair metal or even pop metal or glam metal, whatever you want to. I mean, that was just a a hard rock, heavy metal assault. It didn't have any of the ballads like I Remember You or even the pseudo ballad 18 in Life, which was pretty much commercial suicide in the eyes of many, especially the marketing group. It had three ballads on it, but those weren't the average power ballad. I mean, these were dark and dramatic songs.
Oh yeah, In a Darkened Room, for
Yeah.
example. Yeah.
So they really stepped away and moved in a different direction, whereas most people would have potentially got more commercial. They went in the other direction and got much, much heavier. Now, of course, I loved the Slave to the Grind album, right? I loved the move, and it's one of my top 5 favorite albums ever. But they paid the price in album sales for sure. They did have the #1 ranking right out of the gate, but it didn't sell like the debut because it didn't have the, again, female-friendly I Remember You or perhaps 18 in Life. Not that they made the wrong decision. I guess it's all in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
But yeah, #1 right out of the gate.
Yeah, and that you've led into another question I wanted to ask you about, which was Skid Row making that decision to go much heavier. Warrant deciding to make Dog Eat Dog, much heavier most of the way through. And I had 2 or 3 other examples in mind. But these bands that decided to sort of show their musical bona fides, as it were, by going much heavier on their sophomore or subsequent releases, and then paying the price for their musical integrity by seeing their sales plummet. It's just
Well, it was a combination of things, right? I mean, sure, I think a lot of the bands, the genre was changing probably even long before. The popular phrase is grunge killed hair metal, or more specifically, people would say that Nirvana killed hair metal. And I think there is some truth to that, no doubt, but it's not the whole truth, in my opinion. I think more grunge was just in the right place at the right time. I mean, there were other things that contributed to the downfall of the genre. There's several, in fact. One of the biggest was just simply the market was becoming completely oversaturated for that genre of music. And, there was, copycatting is the wrong word, but it began to be a little stale and a little formulaic. Some of the bands on the back half of that genre, Firehouse, Trickster, Steelheart, Roxy Blue, Tora, I mean, you can name a million of them. And I love
Heaven's Edge.
Heaven's Edge, right? Oh, I love that album. But in all honesty, I mean, they weren't reinventing the wheel. It was very cookie cutter at that point. You put out the first single, which was the hard rock single to get the male audience. Then you put out the big power ballad to get the females. And then you put out the radio friendly kind of pop rock song that got radio play. But bands were already starting to change by 1990. You mentioned Warren, even before Dog Eat Dog, Cherry Pie aside, the single, I mean, Janie Lane was trying to evolve the band on that album. He wrote songs like Uncle Tom's Cabin or Song and Dance Man. Now, of course, all that got overshadowed by Cherry Pie, and we could talk about that for hours. But Cinderella put out an album like Heartbreak Station, which was almost very country-ish, and all the big bombastic production and reverb that was heard on Night Songs and Long Cold Winter was gone. Great White did Hooked, which was very organic. Slave to the Grind wasn't hair metal. Even the Use Your Illusion albums had very little to do with the sound that was on Appetite for Destruction. The glam image had gone out largely with Appetite for Destruction. And I think grunge was really just the tipping point. I mean, hair metal was certainly playing itself out, but there were other things going on as well. We talked about how the music is associated with the surrounding environment, the landscape. Grunge was much more connected to a generation that was experiencing a distinctly different political and socioeconomic climate versus what was present during hair metal's birth and ascension during the 80s. For those that were there during the 80s, I mean, it was literally nothing but a good time. I mean, big and bigger, excess, more excess, and how hard could you party? And then all of a sudden, there had to be this crash to accompany the high. Times began to shift towards things that were more grim, more somber, both economically and socially, and the music had to reflect that. The average American kid in 1992 just couldn't relate to that anymore. They didn't want to have nothing but a good time. They felt angst, they felt alienation, they felt depression, and grunge music was right there to swoop in and satisfy all those needs. It felt real more to them. It was the perfect medium if you were angry or sad or confused or depressed and you want to embrace those feelings, and it allowed you to connect. I mean, hair metal offered nothing along those lines, let's face it. Personally, I was still seeking the exact opposite. But even the accessibility for kids, the music was easier to play, the fashion, they might have looked at Motley Crue and that big spectacle they had on the Dr. Feelgood tour, and they may have had some appreciation for that, but I don't think they could relate to it. The Nirvana got on stage and, hey, they look like they just stumbled out of a garage just like you did. And they looked like you, and, they dressed like you, and you could relate to the type of lyrics they had. I mean, rock music's always been about rebellion, and there was no rebellion for kids in liking something that was already a giant commercial juggernaut. And this started to feed upon itself. And then mostly it was MTV. I mean, again, and basically a mostly non-internet age, MTV was everything in terms of your exposure and your ability to sell records and get people to know of your existence. And MTV and the industry decided, hey, we're only going to have one thing. We're not going to have hair metal and grunge. We're going to have one or the other. And overnight, they completely dropped anything and everything that was related to 80s hard rock. And we like to say it was overnight. I mean, the revisionist history view says it was overnight. Those of us that were there know it wasn't exactly overnight, although it was dramatically quick. I remember seeing Van Halen in concert in 1991, and Alice in Chains opened up. You know, that people scratch their head like, really, how could that happen? I mean, at the time, it was all hard rock. You didn't know yet that the industry was going to make you choose. And boy, they did, right? I mean, you couldn't embrace one. And then all of a sudden, I mean, if you had anything to do with 80s hard rock, you were just a complete and utter discarded laughingstock. I mean, the only other genre I ever had read about that had something, I mean, disco, sure, went south pretty quick. But I mean, this
I
was
love
a
the
genre.
shore.
Yeah.
Yeah, disco.
I mean, they were selling millions and millions of records just 12 months earlier. And then all of a sudden, you know, you couldn't sell out my backyard if you wanted to. So it was quite the change. And I think a lot of things, and you know, I'm not sure hair metal really was built to last, even as it was, right? I mean, at some point, you couldn't, how much faster can you play guitar? How much higher can you sing? How many more laser explosions can you get in your concert? How hard can you party? And you know, these bands necessarily weren't 20 years old anymore. They were 30 years old. And, you know, once you get, you know, it's kind of like that saying, once you turn 30, all hangovers last a minimum of 72 hours. You know, you just can't do it like you used to. So there was a lot that led into the downfall for sure.
Well, I recall, and fairly recently, I watched an interview with Paul Stanley, and he said something to the effect of, you know, if I'd known that I'd still be singing these songs when I was nearly 70, I would have written them in a much lower key, you know.
Well, I don't know any bands that don't tune down. I think Journey is the only band I know of that doesn't tune down their songs, and I don't know how they get away with it. I mean, God bless them; it's amazing. But eventually, time comes to get us all, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, Journey's singer is I think he's still in his 20s, you know.
He's younger, yeah, and he's
Yeah.
amazing. I don't know how he does that night after night. I mean, they don't tune down for him even a stretch. He probably probably wishes they would.
Um, yeah, even well, even Priest have tuned down, you know, a half step, not a full step, but a half step, you know. Although boy, Halford still, when I saw them on the Firepower tour, I was kind of expecting them to start slow, but you know, right out of the gate, you know, he comes out with an amazing, you know, falsetto scream. It's like, oh,
Oh yeah, he can still bring it. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's difficult for a vocalist, especially is the and these, you know, this music didn't exactly lend itself to being easy to sing either. But there are still some guys that can bring it. You know, even in an upper age, people like myself. You know, Dee Snider is up in age, and he can still bring it on stage. Uh, Steven Tyler, Jack Russell, Eric Martin, Phil Lewis, Kip Winger, the Firehouse singer, CJ Snare. These guys can still blow your socks off. Now, others, you know, maybe struggle a little bit more, you know, not to give them grief, but, you know, last time you saw Vince Neil or Don Dokken or Paul Stanley or even David Lee Roth or David Coverdale or John Bon Jovi, you know, the time's caught up with them a little more perhaps. And again, I'm not giving them grief. These are my superheroes, but it's hard.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'm a guitar player. I can't sing. I can't sing worth a damn. And I would say I can't play guitar worth a damn either. But you know, I didn't pick up a guitar for almost 2 decades actually, but I've been playing a lot recently, and it's clear to me that I will never again be, you know, as nimble or as quick, you know, on the fretboard as I was in the late 80s, you know, because it just, like you said, time, you know, it's the one thing that we can't escape. Um, okay, well, okay, so a non-downer question.
Okay.
Who are some But first, yeah, you referred to this a little bit ago. Yeah, the term hair metal. Yeah, I agree. We all hate the term, but we use it right because we know, sort of the specific era and type of pop metal, music that it refers to. So, yeah, no offense to anybody, who is turned off by the term hair metal. I mean, neither Christopher nor I like it either, but you know, it's
Yeah, I mean,
if you use it,
people,
everybody knows immediately what you mean.
that's the thing, right? I mean, people today, I mean, if you weren't there, they may be surprised to know that the term hair metal wasn't even invented until years after the genre's heyday.
Oh
No
yeah.
one said the word hair metal in 1988. I promise. It wasn't really until, again, grunge came out that, people wanted a more disparaging or pejorative term for the music that implied, substance, style over substance. And of course, the bands hated this and
Oh
fans
yeah.
hated this because for the most part, it wasn't true. It just wasn't. I mean, there were some super, super, super talented musicians in this genre of music. Now, don't get me wrong, there might have been exceptions, but for the most part, these were highly skilled musicians. Even a band like Winger, who were kind of like the poster boys for, laughing stock of hair metal. These are classically trained, super talented guys.
Oh
But
yeah.
to your point, it's a universal identifier. I've talked to some people, some fans of the genre, and this breaks my heart, and they won't touch the book because I use the term hair metal. And I get it. Trust me, I am with them every day of every night. I hate the term if people use it negatively. If you were to utter the words hair metal within 100 yards of Nikki Sixx or Sebastian Bach, I mean, they'll rip your stomach out to your throat if they can. But I thought about what am I going to title the book? Well, I could have called it glam metal, but then people might have thought, well, this is about David Bowie or Alice Cooper, the New York Dolls. And I'm not sure glam is too much better, right? Glam equals fashion. I could have called it heavy metal, but then, you think Metallica or Testament or Megadeth, or maybe I just should have used hard rock, but that could have been a million bands. So I said, hey, what is going to be clearest to my audience? And even though I cringe at the title, it's kind of like with Hair Nation or XM Radio, you know what you're going to get when someone says hair metal, right? You're going to get
Right.
Motley Crue, Poison, Guns N' Roses, Skid Row, Warrant, Rat, Whitesnake. And so it was just a matter of clarity, even though I would never label some of these bands hair metal. And I think the other thing is it's evolved over time. Now, not everyone would agree with me about this, and certainly the bands wouldn't, but I think it has evolved over time to be less of a derogative term and kind of more of a happily nostalgic term, at least for many. Certainly not all, particularly the bands. I know they don't get on board with that. I don't blame them. Who wants to be judged on the style of your hair 35 years ago? But again, today, when people say hair metal, I think it's more of a pleasant nostalgia, at least for some of us. So, hey, if you want to spark up a spirited discussion with a fan of 80s hard rock, start talking about the word hair metal and what bands it does and doesn't apply to, right? If you
Right.
could just sit down and put your seatbelt on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a discussion that my brother and I have pretty regularly. He's just a little bit younger than I am, but we both used to have hair.
But generally, I found that fans fall into like three or four segments when they talk about hair metal. Like the super, super casual fan, basically any band in the 80s who played rock and roll who had long hair was hair metal, right? That's the average casual fan. And then you get this second group that becomes a little more discerning. And they throw out, of course, the heavy metal thrash bands. And that makes a lot of sense. So immediately you usher out Metallica and Megadeth and Slayer. But then you get a third group where it gets a little more dicey and a more restrictive taxonomy. And usually the first two bands out of that group, for darn good reason, are Van Halen and Guns N' Roses, right? And you could easily even, I mean, the average person could make the case as to why these are not quote unquote hair bands, right? I mean, Van Halen and Aerosmith both had their roots in the 70s, although Aerosmith on the Permanent Vacation album was pretty hair metal in terms of the template. And Guns N' Roses, you could understand. They'll even throw out Def Leppard, right? And that makes sense. They were part of the new wave of British heavy metal, and they were really too busy in Holland making hysteria in the late 80s to have anything to do with Sunset Strip. But then you get the fourth group, right? And this is where the fun really comes in. And this is where I could argue all day, all night. We can conjure up all kinds of defenses as to why none of these bands should be called hair metal. Arguments you might hear from me or others would be, okay, Skid Row, well, they were too heavy, especially on Slave to the Grind, like we said, or Whitesnake was really just a late 70s and early 80s blues rock band, or Winger was surely a prog rock band that was just in disguise. And then we'll say, well, Faster Pussycat or LA Guns, they were more sleaze metal. And then we'll say, okay, White Lion, well, they were too political to be hair metal because they had songs like When the Children Cry or Cry for Freedom. And then we'll say, okay, Warrant, they were only hair metal on their first two albums. So we'll be sure to distinguish that. And we'll say, well, Bang Tango, they were too funky. And Mr. Big was just too talented. And Tesla was just 70s rock. And Motley Crue, well, they were their own entity, right? I mean, we can make an excuse why none of them were hair metal. And we're very, very right. But at the same time, it's all the same genre of music. There's only a few bands where 99% of people will agree, hey, let's all call this hair metal, whether that's Poison or Quiet Riot or Rat, Kix, Steelheart, Firehouse, Trickster. But again, it is always a very spirited discussion if you're going to call someone's favorite band hair metal.
And lo, part 2 of the 3-part interview with Christopher Hilton has been completed. I hope you liked this video, and if you did like it, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you feel the urge to do so. And by all means, come back for part 3. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.